I've been thinking about this one a lot lately, and it always pulls me back to the same small moment. Late evening, sitting in my car outside a grocery store, engine still on, phone in my hand for no real reason. I remember scrolling and seeing a friend post a photo from a new apartment. Clean lines, good light, plants that looked intentional, like they'd never been forgotten on a windowsill. And I felt this quiet pressure in my chest. Not jealousy, not anger, just this low hum of comparison that showed up without being invited. My place was fine, my bills were paid, nothing was wrong, and still something shifted. It wasn't about the apartment, it was about what it represented. That sense that maybe I was slightly behind, even though I hadn't agreed to any race. I sat there longer than I needed to, telling myself I was content, while that thought quietly rearranged itself in the background. For a long time, I thought matching other people's lives only happened in obvious ways. Bigger places, new cars, expensive trips. But that's not really how it works. Most of the time, it slips in through smaller doors. It shows up as tiny upgrades that feel reasonable in the moment. Ordering takeout instead of cooking because that's what everyone's doing now. Switching grocery stores because it feels more adult. I remember upgrading my phone plan once, adding about $40 a month. Not because I needed it, but because everyone around me had unlimited everything. It didn't hurt. I barely noticed it. $40 a month feels harmless. That's what I told myself. But it wasn't really about data. It was about not wanting to feel slightly out of step. I didn't say that part out loud, I just called it convenience and moved on. There's this strange way money gets tied to belonging, even when nobody ever says it directly. You feel it when group habits shift. Someone casually mentions a new subscription. Someone else starts ordering delivery like it's nothing. And suddenly what used to feel optional starts to feel expected. I remember saying yes to things I didn't really want, just because saying no felt heavier than the charge itself. $10 here, $20 there. It wasn't reckless spending, it was agreeable spending. And agreeable spending is sneaky because it doesn't trigger guilt. It feels polite, normal, like you're just participating. The uncomfortable part is how fast that participation becomes automatic. What once felt like a choice quietly turns into a baseline. And once something becomes baseline, stepping back doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels like you're losing ground, even if nothing about your life actually changed. I didn't notice the math at first. I almost never do. That's kind of the problem. Take something simple like eating out an extra couple times a week to stay in rhythm with friends. Maybe $30 a meal. That's $60 a week. About $240 a month. When I finally said it out loud, it sounded bigger than it felt. Almost $3,000 a year. And that wasn't fine dining. That was convenience. Familiar places. It's just easier tonight. I didn't feel irresponsible doing it. I felt social, connected. But when my bank balance started feeling tighter, I couldn't point to a single cause. There was no big purchase to blame, just a slow, steady drip. That's the uncomfortable part. Leaks don't announce themselves. They just keep going while you're busy telling yourself everything is under control. What really gets me is how invisible the trade-off is. When you match other people's lives, you're not really buying things, you're buying relief. Relief from that low-grade tension that says you're falling behind. I remember telling myself I deserved a little ease. Everyone else seemed to manage it. Why shouldn't I? That logic felt solid in the moment. Responsible, even. But the relief never lasted very long. It wore off faster than the charge cleared. And then there was always something else. Another small adjustment. Another quiet yes. I didn't feel reckless. I felt reasonable. And reasonable decisions stack up just as fast as bad ones. They just do it quietly, without making you stop and look. There's a specific discomfort that shows up when you realize your spending isn't really about you anymore. It's about alignment. About keeping your life visually and socially in step with the people around you. I caught myself once upgrading streaming services just because I didn't like saying, I don't have that. It sounds small, almost embarrassing to admit, but it mattered to me in that moment. Another $15 a month, and then another. Suddenly, I was paying close to $80 just to stay in the conversation. I didn't even watch half of it. But canceling felt like admitting something, like stepping slightly out of frame. I didn't want to look at that feeling too closely at first. It was easier to just keep paying and let it fade into the background. Gas is another one people don't really question. Prices go up, you sigh, and you keep driving. But when your circle starts driving more, longer commutes, more weekend plans, you adjust too. I noticed myself taking extra trips, staying out later just to stay connected. An extra tank a month doesn't feel dramatic. Maybe $60, but that's $700 a year. Over 10 years, that's not nothing. In the moment, though, it just felt like life, like adulthood, like something you're not supposed to complain about. And that's how matching other people's lives works. It doesn't feel like copying. It feels like keeping pace. And nobody wants to be the one who slows things down, even if the pace was never agreed on. Rent is where things start to feel heavier, even if it doesn't hit right away. I remember this quiet pressure to level up my living situation. Not because my place was bad, it was fine. But fine started to feel temporary. Like I was overdue for something better. Friends moved into nicer apartments, better neighborhoods, more space. I told myself it was time. The new place was $400 more a month. I ran the numbers loosely. I could afford it. But afford is a slippery word. That extra $400 didn't come from nowhere. It came from savings that stopped growing, from flexibility that quietly disappeared. And once you sign a lease, there's no emotional undo button. You commit. Not just financially, but mentally. I didn't feel poor after the move. That's the strange part. I felt more settled, more adult, more aligned with where I thought I was supposed to be. But over time, I noticed how much less room there was, not just in my budget, but in my head. Every unexpected expense felt louder. A car repair, a random bill. Things that used to be annoying started to feel stressful. I hadn't changed who I was, but the margin was gone. And margin is invisible until it's missing. That realization didn't hit all at once. It showed up as tension, as restlessness, as that feeling of being financially tired without knowing why. Credit cards made all of this smoother than it should have been. Too smooth. I used mine to bridge gaps without thinking much about it. Dinner here, tickets there. I told myself I'd pay it off next month. And usually I did. Mostly. But even a small balance carries weight. Interest turns small habits into something heavier over time. $100 rolling over at 20% doesn't scream danger, it just hums. It sits there quietly, reminding you that past versions of yourself made choices your current self has to carry. I didn't want to look at that at first. It felt easier to keep swiping and deal with it later. Later always sounds calmer than now. The strange thing is how normal all of this feels, when everyone around you is doing it too. Nobody talks about the cost. They talk about the experience, the place, the convenience. So you match that language. You say it was worth it. You say it was fun. And sometimes it really was. But the bill keeps showing up long after the feeling fades. I remember scrolling through old statements once, not with panic, just curiosity, seeing patterns, seeing how often worth it showed up in my head without ever being written down. That was uncomfortable. Not dramatic, just quiet. Like realizing you've been telling yourself the same small story for years without checking if it was still true. Subscriptions are especially sneaky because they feel like maintenance, not spending. They don't interrupt your day. They hum in the background. And as your social world expands, so do the subscriptions. Fitness apps, music upgrades, shared tools everyone uses. One afternoon, out of boredom, I added mine up. It came out to just over $200 a month. $200 for things I barely noticed anymore. That's $2,400 a year. I didn't feel indulgent paying it. I felt modern, connected, but sitting with that number made my stomach tighten a little. Not enough to cancel everything immediately, just enough to make the noise harder to ignore. There's also an emotional cost that comes with matching other people's lives, the constant low level comparison. Even when you're keeping up, you're still watching, still measuring. Someone else always moves next, buys something newer, does something bigger, and suddenly your version feels outdated. I started noticing how often my spending decisions were reactions, not desires. Reactions to someone else's upgrade, someone else's plan. That realization didn't feel empowering. It felt kind of sad, like realizing I'd outsourced my sense of enough. I didn't want to admit that at first. It didn't fit how I saw myself. But once I noticed it, it stuck. Vacations were another blind spot for me. Everyone posts them. Everyone talks about them. I used to think travel debt was just part of life. Put it on a card. Figure it out later. One trip turned into two. Two turned into a pattern. A $3,000 vacation spread over 12 months doesn't hurt much month to month until you stack a few. Suddenly you're paying for memories long after they faded. I don't regret the trips. I regret how automatic the decision became. How easily everyone's going turned into, I guess I am too. That's the part that still feels strange when I think back on it. There was a point where I realized I felt tired in a way sleep didn't fix. Financially tired. Like my money was already spent before it even arrived. Every dollar had a job. Rent, subscriptions, payments, social stuff. There was no room left to just exist. That's when it clicked that matching other people's lives doesn't just cost money, it costs margin. And margin is what keeps small problems from becoming big ones. I didn't connect that feeling to my habits right away. I just felt worn down, boxed in, like I was doing everything right and still feeling behind. There's a particular silence that shows up when you realize slowing down financially would mean standing out socially. Saying no starts to feel loaded, like you're opting out of something bigger than the activity itself. I used to say yes just to avoid that moment, to avoid explaining, to avoid the pause. That avoidance had a price tag, and the price tag didn't care about my reasons. Money doesn't. It just adds things up, quietly, patiently. That realization didn't make me feel smarter. It made me feel exposed, like I'd been paying to avoid discomfort, and the bill had finally arrived. I started noticing how often I justified things by saying, "It's not that much." That phrase is dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because it's incomplete. Not that much compared to what? Compared to yesterday? Compared to someone else? When you say it often enough, you stop seeing totals. You only see moments. I looked back at 1 year and realized how many not that much decisions lived there. Added together, they were very much something. That realization didn't come with panic, just a slow, sinking awareness that the story I told myself didn't quite match the math. What bothers me most isn't the spending itself. It's how quietly it reshapes your sense of progress. You can be working hard, doing okay, and still feel behind because your reference point keeps moving. Matching other people's lives creates a shifting baseline. You never arrive. You just keep adjusting. And adjusting costs money. It also costs peace. I didn't feel reckless. I felt tired. Like I was constantly catching up to something I never signed up for. That's the part I still sit with. How easy it is to confuse motion with direction. There's a moment, if you let it happen, where you stop and really look at your numbers. Not to judge them, just to see them. That moment can be uncomfortable. It was for me. Seeing how much of my income was tied to keeping up appearances, small ones, subtle ones, made my stomach drop a little. Not because it was catastrophic, because it was unintentional. I hadn't chosen most of it. I drifted into it. That realization didn't come with a fix, just awareness. And awareness can feel heavier than ignorance. Sometimes I think of all those small monthly costs as background noise. You don't notice it until it stops or until it gets loud enough to bother you. Matching other people's lives adds a hum to your finances. At first, it's barely there. Then one day, you realize how quiet things could have been, how much room you might have had. I don't have a clean ending for this, just an image that sticks with me. Sitting at home on a random weeknight, scrolling past someone else's upgrade to seeing life, feeling that familiar pressure flicker, and this time noticing it, letting it hang there a second longer than usual,